Are Christians a bunch of hypocrites? Yes. Thanks for joining us today on Deepish Thoughts. We'll talk about some more topics next week. I hope you can join us for that.
Until next time. Okay, let's go a little deeper into this, shall we? A little bit more into this idea of hypocrisy on Deepish Thoughts. Well, welcome to Deepish Thoughts. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Jeff. And today we are talking about that subject. Are Christians a bunch of hypocrites? We actually asked some of the people here in our church building, hey, are Christians hypocrites? How would you respond if somebody said that? We had some good answers from that, didn't we?
Yes, and I don't know if this is a surprise or not, but pretty much universally the answer was that yes, Christians are hypocritical.
Yeah, and maybe you agree, maybe you don't. I think there's kind of a variety, but generally speaking, if we're asking people who are Christians and they're like, yes, we're Christians are hypocrites, what? I don't know. I feel like that's a pretty convincing argument that maybe they are, maybe we are. Why do you honestly, Jamie? Why do you think that is the case? Where did that reputation come from? And do you think it's like a universal thing?
It seems pretty universal. One thing that somebody said, and I've heard others say this in the past, is that Christians are hypocrites because we're humans, and humans are hypocrites. In other words, Christians don't necessarily have a corner on the market. Maybe there's a unique aspect of hypocrisy in church, and we can get into that, but it's probably helpful to start with just that human beings are hypocritical at times. We all are.
Yeah, and I think when we mean hypocrite, I think we're saying we say that we're supposed to live a certain way, and then we don't actually live that way. Would that be a fair definition?
Yeah,
that's
right.
A really simplified definition, but
I think that's the core of it, not practicing what you preach.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, I don't know, when we came up with this question, I think we were thinking are Christians especially considered hypocrites among other people? And I think I would probably say that they are, though. I would say that people consider Christians more hypocritical than other people, but I think that that's because maybe some people just kind of live life, they live and flying by the seat of their pants. I'm just going to do whatever I feel like in the moment. And in a way, there's less rules involved with that, or there's less, specific ways of living, maybe less principles of living, in that way. And so maybe because Christians live under a set of, moral rules or, practices, maybe because there's more structure, Christians are considered hypocrites more. Would you say that's fair? I don't know. I'm just thinking on the fly here.
I agree with that. Yeah. I mean, let's get back to our definition. If hypocrisy is you're not practicing what you preach, well, if you're not preaching anything, you can't really be viewed as a hypocrite. Or if you're preaching or you're giving the vibe of, we should just kind of do what we feel like. We should just do what we want. Well, you're not setting yourself up to be labeled as a hypocrite in that way. You didn't do what you wanted there. You're a little sacrificial, little unselfish there, kind of hypocritical. You get what I'm saying. If you're not preaching a certain message of living a certain way, then it's hard to actually be hypocritical about that.
Yeah, that's true. So in a way, you're not living a more principled life, but you are avoiding hypocrisy in that way.
Yeah,
so that's that's fascinating. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe that's what it really is about. Well, do you think? So thinking about this reputation then that Christians have, that I think it's fair to say that they have, that we have. I don't know why I say they. We have. Do you think it's a recent development? Do you think have Christians always been viewed this way? What would you say? I don't know.
Seems when we read the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, it says a lot about hypocrisy. So it seems like this has been an issue probably for all of human history. That'd be my guess. What do you think?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think there are. I don't know. I think it's hard because I think about old, in the New Testament, right? When you think about the early church, it seems like they were kind of rock stars. They were doing all this stuff, helping all these people, living out their faith in these really intentional ways and stuff like that. And so I think in a way, my kind of instinct, and I might be wrong, is to think that there was a time in history when they weren't considered hypocrites, when Christians were actually viewed as wow, they're really helping, or they're contributing in a certain way, because there's a lot of times in history where Christians were the ones leading the humanitarian causes, right? Really making an effort to to instill like hospitals and orphanages and things like that were caring for people. And so I think in those moments, because of that, I tend to think, well, maybe at that time, people didn't think Christians were hypocrites. But I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think I would say Christians are still doing those things. So even if we have that reputation now, that hasn't gone away. Yeah. Christians are still building the hospitals, the orphanages, reaching out. It's like both exist at the same time, right?
Yeah.
You were talking about the early church. And in the early church, there's these incredible things going on. But look at like parts of the New Testament that were letters written to some of those early churches. They had major problems too.
They were a mess.
Yeah. So, they were not practicing what they preached all the time.
That's
so
true.
I think both can happen. And I mean, like even in my little microcosm, we're church leaders. We kind of see behind the scenes at church and are familiar with a lot of what's going on at church. You and I could both tell a lot of stories about both things that are going on right now, right? Like here's how we're experiencing even just our local church doing amazing things, giving a lot of money away, helping people in major ways, but also some hypocrisy and dysfunctionality. And, it's all lumped in. In fact, me as an individual person, it's all lumped in there together, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of a train wreck myself in a lot of ways. And yet, God's helping me do some valuable things too. So both are the case, and both are the case, I think, at church and probably always have been.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. But even so, like, why is it that if there's like all these, okay, you said there's both happening at the same time, right? There's this good and there's this bad that's happening. If that's the case, but like even if that's true, right? Say it's like both are existing simultaneously, it still feels like the predominant feeling about Christians is that we're hypocritical. So why is that? Why is it? Do you think people focus more on the negative than the positive? Is that just the tendency, or what's going on?
Well, I mean, we're speculating here, right? Because
totally.
If we're and generalizing a little bit, because can't judge any certain person's motives.
Sure.
But let's think about it a little bit. I would say it's really easy to be critical of somebody else not practicing what they preach because it almost lets you off the hook yourself.
Ooh.
Right? When the focus is on somebody else and their flaws, then you're not focused on your own flaws. Or if you're saying, here's this way of life that's taught, but they don't really do it anyway. Well, I'm taking pressure off myself to feel like I need to live that way or something like that. So maybe it's getting ourselves off the hook. Maybe that's part of it.
That's a really good point. I like what you said about that. That makes sense. Because, we are very quick to shift the blame, aren't we? Like to just be like, especially if there's something insecure about ourselves, it's like, well, look what they're doing, and then we like to do that.
Absolutely.
It's such an easy out.
And church people can be the target of that, and church people can do that.
Totally. Yeah. I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
But what would you say if let's go into a little more specific. We didn't prepare for this, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
Here we go. It's what we do.
We go.
Candid conversations.
All right. What would you say are some like specific ways that people, like Christians, are hypocritical in today's world?
Yeah.
Like today, right now, how are Christians hypocritical? What would you say?
And I guess I'll comment especially about like our society in particular. I have seen Christians act very superior to other people. And that's hypocritical because what we preach or what we claim to preach as Christians is that we're not better than anybody else. We're just like everybody else. We have our flaws. We need a savior. We need forgiveness. That's what we preach. But then we'll kind of contradict that preaching by then giving this vibe of, oh, I am better than you. Oh, I don't need a savior. I don't need forgiveness. I actually am just personally better than you. We can give that vibe. And sometimes someone may not think that specifically about themselves, but it's sort of in the air, or it's sort of the vibe they give.
Yeah.
So that's one primary way I'd say is that air of superiority.
Yeah. That's a great example of hypocrisy.
Any come to your mind?
Yeah, they do. I mean, I think one of the things that Christians tend to talk about is like I think, or at least what's associated with being a Christian is being like, oh, we're going to be kind and we're going to be patient and loving. Like that's a very Christian. I think that's what people talk about. Like Christians talk about, like, hey, we're going to be loving and patient and kind, like, all those different things. But then you go on, like, say, social media, right? And we're doing all the same stuff that everybody else is doing. We see something we don't like, and we're just like, you're trash, or like people are buying into this, like, this anger and this reactionary emotionalism that's just like unkind. And so, like, in a way that I would say one of the things that Christians are supposed to be not superior, but like are called to live to a higher standard is the way we interact with each other. Yeah. And that's involved in exactly what you're saying, right? It's superiority, or acting like we're superior above other people. But in this way, it's like we're acting like we have a right to be like angry, and we have a right to be like, holier than thou. And that's not Christian at all. In fact, if you look at how like we're supposed to be as Christians, we're supposed to be humble, and we're supposed to be slow to react. Like we're not supposed to react in anger, and we're supposed to be kind, including our words, right? The Bible is very clear about that. And I think that's a way that people are hypocritical. Yeah. Because I do that too. I'm not trying to say other people have this problem, because that would be hypocrite. Wouldn't that be ironic if I'm like, yeah, Christians, you need to get better about this, and then I'm doing the same thing? That would be hypocritical. I struggle with this too, and it's like you said, it's the beauty of the gospel, right? I say this is the standard that I'm seeking to obey God in, being more kind and loving with the way I interact with people and the way I use my words, but I still need His help, and I'm still broken, and I'm still, I think that takes humility for us to actually admit that. Doesn't mean we don't struggle. I still, get cut off when driving, and I'm like, you idiot, and like get mad at somebody. That's just part of the process of growth, right?
Yeah. No, it's interesting what you're saying. It's interesting what you said about the social media kind of being a venue where this gets accentuated too, and we've talked about that in previous episodes, but So, one of the things you asked is this a particular problem in our current setting, this reputation of hypocrisy? And maybe the digital age, I don't know, maybe it does get it sort of accentuated.
I think so. I think it does, but that's because, like, I think there's the tendency online to feel like you're anonymous in a certain way. Like, we forget that there's people on the other side of the screen.
Right.
The people reading my comment. Okay, there are bots, right? We know that, but like, besides the bots, right? Like, there are actual people who are like reading stuff, and we're actually hurting people's feelings, or we're being unkind, and there's people who are maybe being hurt by that, right? I'm sure there are people who think of like, I'm sure that there are people out there who have gone to like Christian social media pages, and then see like anger, and maybe they ask a question, right? Like they comment on something, ask a question, and then people are just like, boom, and like destroy them.
Right.
Like, how's that person not going to come away thinking like, wow, Christians are hateful and Christians are unkind? So I think as Christians, we have to remember, like, hey, no, like the way we interact with people, it reflects on our faith, right? Yep. And that's really important, and so like we got to be more careful, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Okay, so I think we agree. Christians have this reputation. Sometimes it's deserved, maybe sometimes it's not. Sure. Sometimes it's a stereotype, sometimes it's exaggerated. But we have this reputation as Christians. So what would you say to the Christians who are watching or listening about how we can help change that perception, at least for some? What can we do?
Well, part of it is understanding like this is just a part of humanity. It's just being like, hey, sometimes I'm going to mess up and be hypocritical. And so I think we need to understand that first as kind of like a basis. It's like, hey, like I'm not going to be perfect. I like to think that I'm going to live perfectly. Like if I really try, but I'm not going to live perfectly. And I think we have to understand that first. But as far as changing the perception, I think that happens little bites at a time. When I am kind to the people around me, right? Because on social media, I think it's hard to really communicate that you care. I think it's just a tricky venue to make that be felt. But I would ask, and I'll ask myself this too, the people that we live next to, right? Our neighbors, like our physical neighbors, and the people that we work with, the people that we're close to, the people we interact with face to face, not over social media, but face to face every day or, throughout our week. How do we treat them? Are we treating them with care and kindness? Because the thing is, I'm not going to learn a lot about somebody from social media. I might learn some facts, but I'm not going to learn to know them personally, right? Like this is going to help me to know you better, not, interacting with you on a screen. It's just different.
Yeah, I agree.
But I would say that if a Christian wants to actually like help people, change this perception, I think it's going to take us actually like living out the way that God's called us to live and being obedient to that. Understanding we're not going to be perfect, but making an effort. So if I see somebody who needs some help with something, hey, I'm going to go help them, and actually just deciding to do that, even if I feel foolish or even if it feels weird, I'm just deciding, I think that's a big way. And so like, practically speaking, hey, my elderly neighbor can't shovel his like walk after it snows. Yeah, I'm just going to go do that for him. That's just a kind thing I can do. Simple, but it helps,
Yeah.
And maybe in that way, I'll start to change their perception of Christians just by some small thing,
Maybe it is a lot simpler than we think, I think that's what you're getting at is you can do simple things just day to day that communicate something to people that maybe they have a stereotype in their mind and you're not fitting that stereotype and it causes them to think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what you said at the beginning there, I think was really important. We got to acknowledge, we have to understand we're not going to be perfect. Kind of starts there. And I would say taking it maybe a little further is we even need to communicate that with people, rather than communicating that we're Christians and here's our standards and things like that. That's fine. But communicating to people our struggles, whether that's struggles with ways we don't think we're necessarily doing what we should do, or ways where we're confused or sad or whatever it is, just weaknesses, being more open about that to people, especially people that don't believe the same things that we do.
Yeah.
I think helps them understand where we're coming from. It kind of takes away that superiority.
Yeah, and that's humility, right? Like, because I think our tendency, going back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, is if I have a problem, right, I want to hide that or I want to dump it off on somebody else. Like, oh, well, look at their problem. It's worse than mine.
Yeah.
But, if I have somebody, say I'm a Christian and somebody like a coworker is not a Christian and I'm struggling with something, my tendency, and I think this is a human tendency, not really specifically a Christian tendency, I think it's a human tendency, is I want to hide that. I want to make myself look good. I want to kind of posture myself to help me and to just make sure I have a good reputation. But I think being willing, like, the fact is, like, if I'm a Christian and I understand that, like, I'm flawed and I need God and I need, like, the salvation that comes from, like, putting my faith in Jesus, well, then I can say that. Hey, yeah, man, I'm struggling with, self-control with, whatever it is. Like, but that's okay, because like I think like God's working in me to help me grow in that area. And I think, who doesn't hear like, oh, I'm growing and getting better and want to be involved in that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think people want to grow and I think people want to get better, but I think a lot of people don't know how. I
think you're right. And somebody who's talking about being in the middle of that, right? Growing, getting better. I think people will be drawn to that if you're open about that, like you said.
Yeah.
There's something foundational about that. Because if you say, I need to grow, I am growing, you're acknowledging that you're not there yet, right? You're acknowledging that you're still a flawed person.
Yeah, and that's important.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, dude, nice.
Jinx.
We're in sync.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is important because like then we destigmatize admitting like, hey, that we have struggles. Because it's not like some people have struggles and some people don't. No, we all have struggles.
Right.
And so if we, to use kind of a buzzword, if we normalize the fact that people just have struggles, well then when I admit that, then somebody else can, like maybe it gives somebody else a little bit of confidence to admit that, because confidence is contagious, right? So
you
we
can
share
open
that
the
with
door.
people.
Yeah, open the door for a deeper conversation. And that's with fellow Christians too, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes a group of Christians will be, wearing figurative masks, not being open about who we are with each other because we're worried about being judged. So in a group of Christians, being open about struggles and failures is is important in that setting too.
Yeah, it changes the game. It changes the game and our direction of growth. I think it makes a huge, huge difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's scary. It could lead to being judged or looked down on or something like that. But that has not typically been my experience.
No.
It does happen. And it is a risk. But my experience when I've had the courage, and many times I have not, but when I have had the courage to open up in a setting, to the degree that it seems appropriate to do that, the response is not typically one of, oh, wow, judgment or I don't know if you should really be a pastor or, it's been more like, okay, we're all fellow strugglers and we're just acknowledging that and going there. And that's helpful.
Yeah.
So Jeff, with all of these subjects, we like to approach it biblically and just see what the Bible has to say about this. So the Bible has a lot to say about hypocrisy. What are some places in Scripture that come to your mind about this?
Yeah, one of the classic examples I think of like hypocrisy, and maybe an example of it that we see in the Bible is the Pharisees, right? Like that's the most common example that we hear about. And that's because they're like, oh, we're amazing. We know God. And, we're just like so close to him. And really like they're way off base. And Jesus talks about that, right? Like he says like, yeah, they're a bunch of hypocrites because they pray openly and they act like they're, so close. He's like, but they don't even know me. And that is really significant because there's these people who look great on the outside and they're doing all the right things, but inwardly they're messed up,
Yeah.
And that is really indicative of like a problem, And so to me, like the Pharisees are just the most classic example.
Can I ask another unscripted question?
Yes.
About that? Because that example is very prominent in Scripture. Do you think that the Pharisees knew that they were hypocrites? Do you think because sometimes when we talk about hypocrisy or kind of deflecting, focusing on others' problems, it's because we're aware of our problems, right? We're aware of our flaws. But could it be that some people are genuinely, convinced that, I am this awesome. I am this much better than other people?
I definitely think that is the case sometimes because we're also a product of our culture, right? And so if the circles that I've run in are like, hey, if you do this, you're right, and that's all well, then you're going to, you might be unintentionally a hypocrite. You just don't even realize it. Because I don't think being a hypocrite is only an attitude thing. I think it can happen even if you have a good attitude. Like, I think it can just happen that way. But I think for the most part, going back to the original question, I think those Pharisees, for the most part, I can't say every single one, but generally speaking, I think they knew. I think they knew what they were doing because they knew the rules and they knew all the laws very well. And they knew that things like taking care of people and taking care of orphans and widows and like all these different things, like they knew that, but they weren't living that out. They weren't living out caring for people who were in need in the same way. They maybe checked a box, but they knew that that's not all that it was. That's my speculation.
No, I agree. Yeah. So we need to be aware. And when we are aware, we need to not suppress that awareness of, oops, here's a gap in my character.
In fact, I think if we become aware of something, I think that's a gift because maybe God's saying, hey, I'm showing you that this is something that you're struggling with and you need to unpack this more, and I think it's an opportunity for us to really grow in a way that's going to be really meaningful.
Yeah, no, that's good. A diagnosis is not necessarily great news, but if we're diagnosing something that's real, it can't be treated until that. So you're right. Yeah.
Well, Jamie, I'll throw the question from back a few minutes ago back to you. What would you say are some other biblical examples of like hypocrisy or what the Bible says about hypocrisy?
Yeah. I thought of some specific examples of things that the religious people or the Pharisees did that Jesus specifically said, don't be that guy. And one of the things that kind of a repeated theme of Jesus is don't be showy in your religion or your virtue. There is a practice of praying to impress people or giving in a public way, fasting, like looking all destitute when you're fasting so people would know you're fasting and be impressed with your spirituality. And Jesus said, that's there are practices that are for you and God, And God knows you're doing that, and he rewards that. And don't be showy about it. To be showy about it is to be hypocritical in a way. So that's one thing that came to my mind. And that's easy to do, right? Is to want to be noticed or celebrated for the things that we do. Yeah. And it's not necessarily healthy.
Yeah. And I think we do that still all the time today, you know, like, and I think we have to maybe check our attitude about stuff because, like, I think of, say, for example, you know, our church, we volunteer at, like, you know, shelters, or we're giving food to people who are in need and stuff like that. If we're taking pictures and we're putting it on social media being like, we're so awesome, like, maybe that's not the way to do that. Maybe we need to consider a different approach. You know what I mean? Maybe we need to say, hey, like, am I doing this to impress other people, to get followers, to get likes or whatever? Or am I doing this because it's the right thing to do?
Yeah.
And let that be enough, because that's what honors God, is just the humble, just like right attitude of just like, I'm going to do this because God has called me to do this. And that's enough. You know?
That's really important. You're right. It is really easy to publicize things, right? Not even spiritual things, but just like, here I am at the gym again or whatever, you know?
It's classic.
Just trying to create this image where people perceive us as really good and really put together and on top of it.
Yeah.
And we don't need to do that. Like you said, there's some hypocrisy.
All right. So we've talked about a lot of things. This is really good. Jamie, what would you say are just some final thoughts? Maybe kind of big picture bullet points.
Yeah, I think where I land in this conversation is we just got to be honest. We got to be honest with ourselves. We got to be honest with other people who may or may not believe like we do. If you're married, be honest with your spouse.
Yeah.
You know, we can't just be all about trying to project an image of ourselves. Got to be real people. And that's super important. And then I guess one other landing point for me is we're not going to do that perfectly.
Yeah.
Or we might feel shame about some of those things that are hard to be honest about. But as you've already said, the beauty of the gospel, we have forgiveness for those things. We have restoration, something to hang on to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm with you on both of those. I don't think I have anything else to add, honestly. I think that's great. But being honest for sure with other people that's huge. So I think that should be so much of our focus.
Yeah.
Being honest, being real. I think that's how we start to break down that barrier of there are a bunch of hypocrites, and we start to change that perception.
Agreed. Yeah. Hey, don't forget to follow us on social media. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Deepish Thoughts.